graduation and how they're expressing their interfaith leadership. So first up, we've got Tasmiha Khan. You can read her bio in your fun little app. So I'm just going to share some fun facts instead. An exciting event in Tasmiha's life. Recently, she was upgraded to business class on a flight from Abu Dhabi back to the U.S. Woo! Right here. Jem is joining us. She is a former personal trainer. So if you've got exercise questions, maybe you want to ask her. And Hannah likes to knit stuffed animals for children. That's something I learned this evening. And moderating our panel tonight is Eboo Patel, author of Acts of Faith and Sacred Ground, and my boss. Let's give him a round of applause.
Great. Good evening, everyone. How's the ILI going? Pretty good? Awesome. Awesome. Hey, so by the way, I just want to let you know that this just happened to just drop from the sky. Nobody on the IFYC team worked super hard for the last 3 months to make sure all of you are here. All the food just magically made itself happen. Tim Stevens at Northwestern did nothing to help this happen at Northwestern. No, there's been a ton of work that's gone into making this awesome. So a big round of applause for the IFYC team, for all of our volunteers, for the folks at Northwestern who host us. Great. Thank you. So I have the best job tonight, which is to say that I get to ask a handful of pointed questions to some of my favorite people in the world, our alums. Some of these people I've known for, boy, what, like 7 years? Hannah. Others I get to see on a regular basis because you guys are in Chicago. The three of you all happen to be in Chicago, and I see you here and there, in and out of the IFYC offices. But outside of being upgraded on flights and sewing stuffed animals, etc., they do great interfaith work, and these are some of the things we're going to get into. Let me just say, we are live streaming, right, Nasser? Great. So we'll have some questions coming in over Twitter, which I'm excited about. And I want to give you a little bit of history for the alumni program and the alumni panel at IFYC. So we spent a good long time convincing people that college campuses were the ideal place to do interfaith work. And then a couple of years ago, we realized that we had left something very important off the table, which is the rest of people's lives, like after they turn 21. And this notion of, what does it mean for me to be an interfaith leader in graduate school or in medical school or in the professional world or just as a citizen or a religious or non-religious person, wherever it is I might be. And thankfully, because we had such terrific people go through our programs at IFYC, we started reaching out to them and saying, what do you do in the world now, and how are you an interfaith leader in the role that you're in? So much of the Interfaith Leadership Institute is about giving you the vision, the skills, the knowledge base, the frameworks, the network to be an exceptional interfaith leader back on your campus. This session is about giving you an image of what it looks like to be an exceptional interfaith leader 4 or 8 or 12 years down the road. We think that it's a lifelong identity category. It's like being a human rights activist. It's like being an environmentalist. It's like being a social entrepreneur. It's the kind of thing that, God willing, you will do for the rest of your lives. And so I'm thrilled that the three of you terrific people are joining us for this conversation. So, Tasmiha, let me begin with you. In the first couple of questions, we'll just run up and down the panel. Tell us what you do now, what you're spending your time on, and tell us how you are an interfaith leader in the role that you're in.
Sure. So, good evening, everyone. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt your dinner, so feel free to eat away and listen to us ramble while you do that. So currently, I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit that I started while in college known as Brighter Dawns, and our mission is to improve slum conditions in Bangladesh, beginning with the water and sanitation crisis. In Bangladesh, it's predominantly Muslim, but there are also many Hindus and Christians and Buddhists too. The conversation, the topic of interfaith dialogue is something that is not very prevalent, And it's something that you don't really hear of both abroad and in the States, especially on college campuses, at least when I was in college back in, I graduated in 2012 from Wesleyan. So I started, me and a couple colleagues, we started Writer-Ons while in college, and then after graduation, I spent my time between being in the States and in Bangladesh. And currently, we are, I actually, as Prerna just said, I just came back, and we are trying to figure out what kind of sustainable method can be utilized to engage in water sanitation issues in the Islam of Kalishpur Khulna, particularly looking at the repair and maintenance model and how interfaith cooperation can be a social norm in that capacity.
Great. I'm just going to press you a little bit on this. So,
Sure.
so why do you need the interfaith leadership skills you acquired as a student at Wesleyan in the work that you're doing at Brighter Dawns? And I'm gonna push and poke each one of you in this kind of a way, but we're starting with Tasmiyah here.
It's important to step outside of your comfort zone, because if you are constantly being around people that are like you in faith, in nationality, you sometimes fall into this bubble, and that can be very detrimental to you, because you don't realize that, you know, there are people, even though they may be different outwardly, they're in fact very similar to you. And being able to connect with someone that quote unquote, might be different, but in fact being able to pull those similarities is so powerful. The perspectives that you gain, the resources that you can achieve, just being able to understand from another person and say, hey, you're looking at the book from this end of the page, whereas I'm looking at the book from this page, but in the end we're reading the same story, is incredibly powerful. So, and I have to thank IFYC for that, but we'll get into those questions.
Great, thank you. Great. Jem, tell us what you're doing now, and tell us how you're applying the interfaith leadership skills that you learn and you're continuing to learn in your situation.
Sure. So in some ways, my job is interfaith engagement, which I highly recommend. It's the best job in the world. I'm both a Master of Divinity student at the University of Chicago, and I'm a staff person at the Spiritual Life Office. And my main job there is to convene our interfaith council, or we call it the Spiritual Life Council. And like Tasmiyah said, it's really important that I step outside my comfort zone, because I could very easily just sit in the office and be around people that are very committed to interfaith cooperation and that know the language, and they know that working together across faith traditions is really important, and it's almost a given. But there's much work to be done, even at the University of Chicago. So I try to take leadership positions that are not outside of the Spiritual Life Office, outside of the Divinity School. I try to attend events and take classes with people that might not know what interfaith is. And I think trying to be mindful of where you can apply your interfaith leadership skills anywhere is really important. So for instance, at the Divinity School, we have social events. They happen once a quarter, and they're called 4 to 8s, and they happen from 4 to 8 p.m. Witty name. And originally, they were sort of this social gathering that was centered around coming together and drinking beer and eating food. And, you know, that's fun for a certain amount of the community. But as we become a more multi-faith community, we need to recognize that that might not be inclusive and welcoming for many members of our community. So working with the Divinity Students Association, we can come up with different ideas to have social events. And one thing that's really important, or one aspect that's really important of that, is bringing people that will be able to advise us on what we can do to be welcoming. Having a Muslim student and a Jewish student and other members of other faiths to be able to advise and make suggestions is something that you can do in any field that you go into. It doesn't have to be specifically on campus or having to do with religion at all.
Great, thank you. Hannah.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I am currently the pastor of a little Methodist church on the northwest side of Chicago, which means that I do a lot of things. Some of the things that you think of, like I have the privilege to prepare people for marriage, to guide them through life and through death. I preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. I also, on occasion, fix toilets and find out how we're going to get the snow off of the parking lot. And help us organize programs for our community. For instance, this year, we, for the very first time, hosted a spring break safe haven. A lot of you probably have heard that Chicago is not a safe place to be for some public school students, and those public school students do have a zone of safety in their schools. During spring break and during summer, that and the meal that comes with it goes away. So our mayor approached all of the faith communities in Chicago this year and asked us to host an open space for children to come, for any child to come. And my church took on that challenge, and we had 40 kids in our building every day for spring break. We were feeding them a meal. We were doing fun activities. And that was by design and by the rights of those children, not religious education or religiously affiliated, which brings me to one of the interfaith aspects of my job, which is that the God I serve came to earth in the form of a human and told us that every time we serve someone in need, we're serving him. And there are a lot of ways my community needs to be served that I can't do without partners of other religions and identities. So part of my commitment to Christ is working with whoever's going to help me to serve him here on earth. So that's been a big way that interfaith leadership has been a part of my pastoral leadership. And I'd say the other two big ways it's really come in is, A, just the skills that I learned have been applicable to almost every day of ministry. I don't know how many of you are a part of a faith community that is accountable to one another, but it's not like the arguing stops once you're just in your own religious tradition. All of my skills at facilitating difficult conversations, at figuring out how to work together when we have profound disagreement, come into play all the time. And then particularly as I serve the youth and young adult members of my congregation, I can talk them through what it means to be a Christian on the streets where not everybody else is a Christian, as well as a Christian in the church where everybody else is, which is something I think many of my fellow clergy who are excellent leaders and are prepared in so many ways, who are not interfaith leaders, are not prepared to do that. And our youth are really kind of suffering from that. So those are the big ways that I would say interfaith leadership has come into my current professional life.
Great. So, I'm just realizing, of course, Prerna and Amber had the genius to design all of this, but I'm a little slow. So I'm just realizing that part of the beauty of this is that the three of you are in very different kind of sectors, right? So Tasmia, you created Brighter Dawns, right? So you're a social entrepreneur in the nonprofit sector, and you're seeing how a health-focused organization that you founded in Bangladesh, which is a largely but not entirely Muslim country, interfaith leadership skills are useful. Jem, you're a professional in higher education. You're also a student, but you're a professional on an elite college campus. And you're not only doing interfaith with the folks who show up, you are actually very proactively going outside of those spaces to be part of conversations where people might be hostile to or at least not have heard of this work. And Hannah, you're in the pulpit, right? So I'm loving this notion of these frameworks, this knowledge base, this skill set is applicable to a whole range of kinds of work. So here's my second question. We'll start with Jem, go to Hannah and Tasmia on this. So tell me an early experience that you had in your life that dealt with religious diversity or interfaith issues that kind of served as something of a spark for the commitment that you have made to being an interfaith leader. Jem?
So my faith actually comes from, I like to say it all started with basketball. When I was 9, I joined an all-Japanese-American basketball team in Southern California because my best friend was Japanese-American, and we went to a Catholic school together. My family is from a Catholic background. And the team was really intense. We had to practice 3 times a week, and we traveled on weekends, and so as you can imagine, we got to be pretty close friends, and I got to know my teammates as these really good people, and their families were really good families that I wanted to be with all the time. And I learned a little bit about their culture and specifically their faith traditions, and some were from Christian backgrounds, some were from secular humanist backgrounds, and some were from Buddhist backgrounds. And no one ever told me that because my faith was different, that was a bad thing. I simply thought these people are good, thus their faith must be good. And because of my teammates and because of all the time I spent playing basketball, I actually went to a boarding school that would let me go to Japan and study there for a year. And I remember going to school every single day when I was in Japan. I had to take the train, and I had to pass through this train station called Shinjuku. And as Hannah knows, that's one of the busiest train stations in the world. Over 1 million people pass through that station every single day. So you can imagine, it's busy, it's crowded, it's loud, there are colors, there are lights, there's noise, there's everything. It's like Times Square. But on the main road, you can walk down the path right outside the station, and there's a Buddhist temple. And as soon as you step onto the ground of that Buddhist temple, it's like you're in a different world. There's peace and tranquility, and there's such a reverence for this space. And the first time I experienced that, I knew I had to learn more, and ended up studying religion in college, and found that even studying religion wasn't enough, but living it, and living it through the people that practice it, was something that I needed and still need to this day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Every time you tell stories, you realize there are these overlaps that you didn't know about, and I feel there are so many in our story. One is that I am not the religion now that I was born. I converted to Christianity as a teenager, but was raised in a family that was non-religious. My mother had been raised Catholic, my father had been raised Lutheran, and both of them had had experiences that are somewhat typical of their generation that had convinced them that the church was not a great place to be. And so I wasn't raised with any religious education of any kind. I lived in Japan until I was 9 years old, and so I had been to a lot of Buddhist temples, but sort of as a cultural experience, and no one had taught me anything. I didn't really know how any of this worked. But my first memory of interfaith and religious diversity and needing it in my life is actually from 4th or 5th grade. I had moved to the United States. I was in a little town called Champaign-Urbana in the middle of the cornfields, but a university town in Illinois. So there was a huge amount of religious diversity. And my best friends, just from my classroom, were coincidentally a Bangladeshi Muslim girl, a rabbi's daughter, and a Mormon girl. And then I was sort of agnostic, atheist, didn't know what to call myself, didn't have a name, didn't know what anything was about. And we were invited, and we never talked about our religious traditions except that we kind of knew these names, right? And we were invited to a speech contest, an oratorical speech contest, and we had each prepared our little speeches about what mattered to us, and there were kids from all over the state, kids from every school, kids were homeschooled, and one of the kids who was homeschooled got up and started giving her speech, and she was Christian, one of the first Christians I had met who named themselves that way, and her speech was about how the country was falling apart because we didn't have Christian prayer in schools, and we needed to institute Christian prayer in schools immediately. And now, as an adult, I can hear that view and have a conversation with her. As a 9-year-old, my response was like, "Am I making America fall apart?" Oh no! And as the speech went on, I sort of realized I was looking to my left at Soraya and looking to my right at Sarah and Camille and thinking, like, I'm not sure she knows that we exist. Because these girls are super nice to me, and I really like my classroom, and we've never prayed like that once. And I just remember feeling like very unseen. I wasn't mad at the girl, but I felt like there was something missing, something that we didn't know about each other, and I didn't even know what it was. And there was no kind of build-off of that. It was just this strange experience that I didn't know how to process for a long time. So that's my first memory of needing that.
My first memory would probably be when I was in 1st or 2nd grade. I went to Agassiz School in downtown Chicago. And at the time, I used to wear my hijab on and off just for fun. And when I did that, occasionally I used to get laughed at. And there was one point where one of the students actually took it off. And I was really upset. My mom was like, "Okay, we're sending you to Islamic school." And in 1998, I started at Universal in Bridgeview. And I was like, awesome, there's Muslims everywhere. This is safe haven for me. I don't need to worry about anyone else treating me differently. I was like, this is it. right? And what does a 9-year-old know? And then 9/11 happened. I was in 6th grade, and my school was shut down for almost about 2 weeks. And that's when it really struck me that we weren't necessarily safe, or things weren't like they were ever before, and they still aren't. And I didn't know how to make of it as a 12-year-old, but I realized that, okay, we would need to engage in conversations with people who are of different faiths and of different just different folks who are not Muslim per se, because not everyone would necessarily understand that, hey, what is portrayed in the media is not accurate. And then I started engaging in interfaith meetings with people of different faith traditions, and I realized that the importance of it, because through just conversation, you get to dispel so many myths and so many misunderstandings that I never thought would have such an effect. And I really enjoyed and appreciated interfaith at that time, but I didn't know how to, I guess, do it properly. And IFYC came to the rescue. So, yeah.
It's my favorite part of the story. I mean, I love these stories, right? And some of them I've heard before, but you know, I love them. And Hannah, one of the things I love about your story is that the story you tell is not a particularly positive story, a particularly positive face, if you will, of Christianity, and yet something you found really intriguing, beautiful, and you followed that. I think that is, I find that especially powerful dimension of your story. And the way you kind of frame it is, it wasn't something that sent you 100 miles the other way forever. Obviously, I am a Christian minister because this 9-year-old girl thought that I was the one making the world fall apart. Thank you. Write that girl a letter, right? Yeah. So here's my third question. Let's talk about the interfaith work you did in college, right? Let's talk about really any part of the elephant. Tell me about the best interfaith project you ever ran, like create this massive anxiety of influence amongst all these young college interfaith organizers. Tell us about like the worst interfaith mistake you ever made. Tell us about the interfaith event that you ran or program you went to that is still deeply informing your work now, right? So what is like really live for you as far as your interfaith experience in college? Hannah, we'll start with you and just go down the line.
You don't need to worry about anxiety. The first few years of my college experience, I had at that point converted to Christianity, and I had fallen hard for Jesus. I was very, very into my faith. I had done a year of service between high school and college in the Mississippi Delta that had convinced me that I also wanted to change the world, that racism and poverty were real, and they were evils, and they needed to be combated. And those two things were happening for me at the same time and in deeply connected ways. And they were happening on my campus in 100% separate arena. I had a life of social change and volunteering, and I had a life of faith. And on my campus, they just didn't join ever or really acknowledge one another's presence. I was in a gospel choir that kept me in college, that like did so much for me, but we never did anything together except Bible devotion and singing. And then I was a part of these organizing groups and student groups that were really trying to make change in our community, trying to do new things, and religious people were the enemy, if ever mentioned, in those circles. So that was a challenge for me, that these two seemed to me to be so connected, but in the way that I had to live my life with other people, they weren't. And Interfaith Youth Corps stepped in. Well, a couple things stepped in. I worked a little bit with an organization called Interfaith Worker Justice here in Chicago, where I worked on a living wage campaign in Memphis that was an interfaith campaign. So religious leaders and leaders of moral communities came together to fight for something together. And I came back to campus and I heard about Interfaith Youth Corps through an email from my dean of religious life, and heard from them finally a way that I could be whole and integrated instead of this fragmented person all the time, having to hide one part of myself or justify and apologize for it. And after I had gotten some of that training, I started to do interfaith work, where we would come together, some of the people I had met from these two circles. We did a series of 101s on different religions, some of which were horribly attended because we gave them names that were just like Zoroastrianism 101, Hinduism 101, instead of explaining to people, I think, why that would impact their life. So that there's an organizing tip for you.
We call them speed faithing now.
Right,
so
speed faithing, yes.
We've gotten better at that.
Yeah, well, and that you need to explain to people, right, why that would be relevant to them, why that would matter, why that would be interesting. I was on a campus that was not particularly religious, and why is this relevant to you? And the other things that we started to do together were more public events where talking about who you were and what inspired you was something that you could do. We had a table set out at a major college festival. We facilitated a conversation about what had inspired you after a community service day using a really simple guide that IFYC had at that time. I don't know if it still does, with the verse or text from a variety of traditions and talking about, do any of these represent you? Do none of these represent you? What inspires you to be here and serve? And I'll say having that conversation after that community service day, which hundreds of students participated in my senior year, was a transformative moment, I think, for many of them, that it could possibly matter to figure out why you did something and share that with other people, that could help them get on board, that could help them understand. So those are the first couple things that come to mind. I'm sure more will come up as we talk about campus organizing. And the Interfaith Council started the year that I was there, so we had a lot of ups and downs with how well that worked as a community.
So the story that comes to mind for me is in the course of about 3.5 to 4 months when I was in college, my life changed completely from not knowing at all what interfaith meant to committing a year of my life to building an interfaith campaign around the Millennium Development Goals in a city across the country. And how this happened is I was studying religion at the University of Southern California, and like I said, I had been taking classes, and I was really enjoying those, but it felt like something was missing. Couldn't quite explain what it was. I was working over the summer at the financial office in the business school, and was kind of bored one day, and something in the trash caught my eye, and it was the headline of the Daily Trojan, and it said, "New Dean of Religious Life at USC." And so I was like, well, okay. So I pulled it out of the trash, and I read it, and it was about Dean Varun Soni, and he was this amazing person. He was the first Hindu in this type of position anywhere in the country, and he had studied in Nepal and Tibet as a Buddhist monk, and he had gone to Harvard Divinity School, and he had a radio show about religion and politics, and owned a graphic novel company, and was just the coolest person in the world. And so I decided I need to meet with this person. So I emailed him before he even started work, and he said, when I start, we can meet, and I, a little bit eager. So I met with him the very first day that he started work, and the first 10 minutes of our conversation were a little bit like, why are we meeting? And then, we started talking about studying religion and what comes after college. And he said, you really need to join the Interfaith Council. And I remember emailing him like a week before school started saying, is there a dress code? Like, you said it's for dinner. But showed up, and the third week of school, Dean Soni told the Interfaith Council, we need to go to this event. It's being hosted by the Interfaith Youth Corps and the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. And that's all he said. And we were like, okay. So 3 students went, and it ended up being the announcement of the Faiths Act Fellowship, which was a year-long fellowship for 30 fellows, the inaugural year, to spend a year in a host city and with a host organization building an interfaith hub around the Millennium Development Goals. So I went from not knowing what an interfaith council was to having to train to basically teach people how to build one. And the cool thing about the Interfaith Council is these people are still some of my best friends, and they do amazing things, just like Dean Stoney. They work for, one of my best friends is in New York City working for the Huffington Post. Another is at medical school in San Francisco. Another is in Japan studying Buddhism and the Soka Gakkai tradition. So even though they're all over the world, we have this connection because we want to ask meaningful questions, and we want people to be able to communicate across differences. And so the stories of my friends inspire me every day, and especially when the work gets hard, there's something that I keep in the back of my mind.
I had, I guess, for interfaith organizing, it started in freshman year where it was Ramadan, and many of my non-Muslim friends, they wanted to fast with us, and we were like, yeah, you know, you're welcome to do so. At that time, it wasn't 17 hours like it is now, from sunrise to sunset, well, a little before sunrise to sunset, and we decided to create a fast-a-thon. It was essentially a hunger banquet where we had different organizations across campus, one of the main being Interfaith Justice League, coming together and organize this hunger banquet where the day's points and meals, any money that we would be spending for the meals would be going to our local food shelter, and in the process we would be learning about different faiths. And I wasn't as involved with interfaith movements at that time because it was my first year, but through the Interfaith Justice League, the organization that collaborated with us, I learned about Interfaith Youth Corps on a greater level in terms of how I could be involved at the campus, college campus level. And that's when I became an IFYC scholar, and I met Hannah, actually, and she was my trainer at the time, back in 2009. So, and I've been part of IFYC ever since.
Cool, thank you. So I'm going to do a couple more things before turning it over to audience questions. The first is, I'm looking at these two tables here, and I'm like, oh yeah, our organization doesn't exist without you people. So I just want to say a big thank you to IFYC board members who showed up, Howard Morgan, Alan and Andrea Solo, to President's Council members who are here, Zuhair Khan, my friend Mark Williams, Joanne Segrin, who is the chair of our President's Council. We have two college presidents here. We have David Parkin from North Park. We have Doug Baker from Northern Illinois. Jess Green is hiding behind a student, but she's a board member also. So a huge thank you to all of you for coming on a Monday in August to see the fruit of really your investments in your work. A big, big thank you. There's also a handful of people here who believed in Interfaith Youth Corps, really, really early, when it was basically 9 voices in my head. Scott Matheny, the chaplain at Elmhurst College, Tim Stevens, who's the chaplain here. Huge, huge thanks to you guys. John Powers is back there from Ohio Wesleyan. I think you have been to more Interfaith Leadership Institutes than anybody alive, including me. So thank you for bringing another delegation of students. There's a great line. Somebody said, it takes a lot of people to keep Mr. Gandhi in poverty. It takes a lot of people to keep Interfaith Youth Corps doing the work that we do, and you guys are a huge part of that. So a big, big thank you. So here is my last question, and not all of you have to answer it, and Jem actually whispered a great answer in my ear, so I'm going to start with her on this. But one of the things that's interesting about interfaith work, of course, is that a lot of people enter it in an entirely positive way, in the sense of like, wow, these religions have so much in common, and I just want to learn everything and bring it all together, right? And then they'll go to like an interfaith program, and they'll come out and they'll be really mad at me, and they'll be like, but there are people in there who don't believe in God the same way that I do. I'm like, it's called an interfaith program. What did you think you were going to, right? So, there is a version of diversity, and I think religious diversity and interfaith work in particular, because it's a dimension of diversity we don't talk about as much publicly, at least in the United States, that it's basically like interesting ethnic foods, right? Like some people like samosa, some people like egg rolls, and if you're like big enough, you like them all, right? And then, the Supreme Court hands down the Hobby Lobby verdict, and people polarize. And then things blow up in the Middle East, and people polarize. And you're like, oh yeah, people have really deep disagreements over fundamental matters that are driven by religious convictions. Welcome to interfaith work. That's what we do, right? We build a diverse democracy. And a diverse democracy is a place where people who orient around religion differently have deep disagreements on fundamental issues, and it still continues to function. And sometimes when I say that, people are like, yeah, dude's kidding. Not now, right? Because everybody knows in this past month just how deep the disagreements can get. So here was my question for the panelists. It wasn't, which side are you on? It's, tell me about a conversation in which you had a deep disagreement with somebody and in which you held up the three legs of a diverse democracy: respect for identity, relationships between diverse people, and a commitment to the common good, right? And we've gone back to that over and over and over again at IFYC. Right? Diverse democracies are about having respect for people's identity, having relationships between people who disagree deeply, and having a commitment to the common good. So, Jem, you had a great answer to that. Let's start with you, and then Hannah and Tasmiha, you're welcome to get in if you'd like, and then we'll go to audience questions. And just to let you know, you're going to ask me a hard question, and I'm going to kick it to one of them. So that is just the deal, just so you know. Jem.
So in April, I was on a Greyhound bus, and I was on a kind of a long trip. I was going to St. Louis, which is about, I think, 7 hours. So keep that in mind. So this man sat next to me, and he asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I study religion." And without any further questions, he said, "Oh, thank God, someone is spreading the gospel and following Jesus and knows that Jesus is the way." And clearly didn't know much about me. And then he continued to say how upset he was that these other faith traditions, I think he used a worse word than that, but like Islam and Judaism and the atheists, don't even get me started, and how lost they are. And what took me aback was not necessarily this man's faith, because there's nothing wrong with being a Christian, but how I felt that he had been misinformed about these other faith traditions being a source for good in the world. And so at that moment, I sort of had to be a good Buddhist and put myself in the moment and check in and make sure I didn't get into an argument or get angry, because it was an 8-hour bus ride. But I had to, the best thing I could think of to do, which is what IFYC trained me so well to do, was to remind myself and re-inspire myself real quickly with the stories I had from my friends of other faith traditions. So I remembered quickly Runda, who's in the room somewhere, when we would take those long walks after the Iman taking it to the streets trainings. Or I would remember students on my interfaith council with, there's a moment that seems really simple, but that's really powerful to me. We had an interfaith retreat in the fall for the Spiritual Life Council, and as college students, we know it can be really difficult to wake up early on a Saturday morning. So these two students had agreed that they would call each other and wake each other up to make sure they didn't miss the bus that was at like 7 a.m. And I remember kind of waiting for the students, and these two students were walking up the path, a Jewish student, Rachel, and a Muslim student, Rafia. And it seems like second nature, perhaps, to us, but we need to remind ourselves that that story does not happen everywhere in the world, especially perhaps right now. And that if we want interfaith cooperation to be a social norm, it's those stories that we need to lift up, because it might seem like a social norm to us, but it's not yet. And yeah, I guess that's my story.
That was, I love that. Thank you for telling that. I mean, one of the reasons I love that is you can tell a million stories about yourself being in that position, right? What if you're on a Greyhound bus, 8 hours in that beautiful ride to St. Louis, right? A stop off at Steak and Shake in Champaign-Urbana, and somebody sits next to you and thinking that they're honoring you says something offensive about your faith tradition, right? So what do? And you think to yourself, okay, this person, I mean, they get to have their view, right? They get to have an understanding of their tradition, but I get to be who I am also. So how do I honor these different identities? How do I build some kind of a relationship? After all, this cat's going to be next to me for 8 hours, and how do we not have like a screaming, scratch our eyes out fight on this bus, which would be bad for the common good of said Greyhound bus ride, right? So like thinking through that, and one thing, Jem, one of the things I love about what you're doing, right, is you honor your Buddhist identity by taking like the meditative aspect of the tradition and saying, okay, I'm going to do a check-in with myself, back up, and come back to this. And then you're running the tape of all of these beautiful Christians you've known in your life who have been really positive to you, right? And I think to myself, these are learned skills. Those are learned skills. And those are things that are practiced. They're practiced at places like Interfaith Leadership Institutes. They're practiced at places like college campuses when you go back and you run your Better Together campaign. So I love that, and I'm going to be thinking, you know, when you see me walking through Evanston, like talking to myself, I'm going to be saying, so what happens when this person sits next to me on a Greyhound bus ride and says something like inconceivably offensive? I hope that I check in with my Muslim nature and like come back a little bit kinder. So Hannah, Tasmail, you guys want to get in here, tell a story or two, and then we'll go to the audience. Hannah.
Yeah, so I think what occurs to me about the topic, right, which is these issues on which you fundamentally disagree and in which you think the position the other person holds is potentially really harmful for people and for the world. That's the part that's tricky, right? It's not the disagreeing, it's I think the position you hold is going to hurt people. And here's the temptation I had when I was in college. I thought that when someone held a position like that, my getting mad at them or unfriending them on Facebook made any difference. It doesn't. I mean, that's the reality. When you think about how you're going to interact with someone with whom you profoundly disagree, even someone who you think holds views that are actively harmful, I want you to really think about whatever step I'm about to take, what is 10 steps down from this step? Because if the step is cut off the relationship, 10 steps down is you have no idea, and you feel purer because you don't have conversations with people who fundamentally disagree with you, but you have changed no one's mind, and you have offered nothing to the world. That sounds really harsh now that I say it out loud, but
refriend all of those people you unfriended on Facebook.
Right? But if you're having a conversation with someone with whom you profoundly disagree, no matter how much it hurts, and you find a way to stay in relationship with them and continue to hear them and continue to talk to them, 10 steps down the road might be them changing their mind, or it might just be that you do something entirely else on a totally different topic and you haven't ruined that potential by cutting off this relationship. Relationships where people are harming you, right, in an active and consistent way are different. But I think those happen pretty rarely. And a lot of times we think someone just holding a view is something we can't take, and we have to be braver than that to build the kind of world that we're talking about. We have to be stronger than that to build the kind of world that we're talking about. We have to take a little bit of crud, right? So my story of my interfaith training kicking in comes when I was a baby minister, all of 13 or 14 months ago. I had just started at a church, which is a beautiful church. I love my community so much. It is full of the most loving and faithful people. I thank the Lord every day that I have been sent there. What they do for each other, what they do for the community is amazing. One issue on which they had no conversation because it was too scary and that was not what brought them together was homosexuality and human sexuality in general. Didn't talk about it, never talked about it. We have many generations, everybody from 2 to 85. I think people sensed that maybe we had some disagreements, and so it was never going to come up. And I'll be honest, that my plan for my first 3 or 4 months there was that I was not going to bring it up either. I felt like I needed to build trust with these people. They had no idea who I was. They needed to know that I loved them, and they needed to start to love me before we could have any kind of effective conversation on anything more difficult than, like, when are we planning after worship lunch? But someone else made that decision for me when at a men and women's breakfast, someone who was supposed to give a prayer about our meal, basically blessing the food, was feeling deeply upset over a recent Illinois State Supreme Court decision regarding equal marriage. And they got up and said, like, I pray that God would stop these horrendous and horrific things from happening. Our court has gone the wrong way. And I could feel the muscles of every person in the room tense up. The people who were with him, the people who weren't with him, everyone was afraid. And I didn't know any of them. This was like 3 weeks in. So I got up to the microphone and I said, we can see from looking at the world, and this was 100% interfaith instincts just channeled through my Jesus lens that's always on. We can see from looking at the world that this is an issue on which good and faithful people disagree. But the church has always been a place where we are supposed to bring our whole selves. And I want us to continue this conversation, but what I want us to do as we continue this conversation is remember when Jesus stood in front of a woman who people were trying to throw stones at and asked for the first person to throw, right, to be the one who could take it. And I want us to know that all of us at some point in this conversation are going to feel like people are throwing stones at us, and let's treat each other like beloved children of God. And I didn't share my view until days later, and I kind of worried about that. Am I not standing up for justice by not sharing my view? But what I did by saying, good and faithful people can disagree, let's have an entirely open conversation. And we did, and people said some stuff that I thought was poorly phrased, and people said some stuff, right, that was a problem. It began what has now been like a year-long educational journey for our church. And people are saying 100% different things and continuing to eat lunch together. Moms and kids are having this conversation for the very first time that they have never had before, and our church is not split over it, right? And at one point, we're going to have to make some choices, right? Someone's going to ask us to marry them. I have been preaching about certain kinds of things, right? We're going to have to make some choices, and those are going to be harder than the conversations are. But I trust, because of what I've seen them be able to do, be able to be so profoundly loving in the midst of people who really think that the other person is damaging the world through their view, that it's possible for anything and it's possible for anybody.
Thank you for that. Mia, do you have a story?
I do. Mine actually goes back to college, and it had to do with a biology professor. We were learning about evolution, and I wanted to meet with him, and he didn't seem very welcoming, but I decided to be persistent and eventually got a meeting with him. And I wanted to understand a couple of the concepts he explained in class and for an upcoming exam. And he told me, I asked him, are these the chapters you want us to, are these the points in these chapters that you want us to memorize, or not memorize, to understand? And he was just like, well, I know back home you guys memorize everything. And I was taken aback, and I'm just like, wait, what? I was born and raised here, Professor. I don't know what you're talking about. And he was just like, well, you certainly dress differently. And I just froze for a second, because I just thought that maybe, this is typical of tenured professors in higher institutions. Not to offend anyone in the room, but I just didn't know. I was a first semester freshman, and and he was just like, you dress differently. And I'm like, Professor, I was born and raised here, and I feel liberated by this. This is a hijab, and I feel I'm comfortable in this. No one has forced it upon me. I enjoy who I am and how I dress. And he just snorted, and he said, we'll see how far you go. And I was traumatized, to some extent, because I was just like, I left the room crying. I remember that. And right away I had applied to transfer out from Middletown, Connecticut to my home state, Chicago, Illinois. And I thought, you know, this is it. I'm going to come back to DePaul, Loyola, whoever accepts me. I'm just coming back where it's a little bit more diverse here. And being one of the only few Muslim, one of the only Muslim women covered in the university, population about 4,000 people, I had the rabbi actually come up to me and he was telling me that, hey, you're probably the first Muslim woman who is not an international student who's graduating from our institution. And I was really surprised. I mean, it was both something that kind of overwhelmed me a little bit, but at the same time, it was hard to kind of think about how would I, you know, traverse this path by myself, especially after that professor incident. It really shook me. And I thought, you know what, I'm coming. I was crying to my mom, my friends, everyone. I was just like, I'm coming back to Chicago, and because Chicago is just, it's awesome. I love Chicago. Anyways, and you know, but I had a mentor who also born and raised in Chicago. He told me that, you know, maybe your purpose at Wesleyan is not just to get your bachelor's. Maybe it's to create a path for those who might come after you, to make it easy for those who will come after you. And I didn't think of that. You know, it just never occurred to me. And later, I still keep in touch with people from Wesleyan, and many of my deepest relationships come from college. And I realized that, you know what, that's true. Lo and behold, the second year, I ended up staying. In the second year that I was there were other students who saw me for the first 2 years covering that they also embraced the hijab. And there was one student who also even became a Muslim, and she said, you know what, you're doing it so flawlessly, little did she know, that we shouldn't be shy either. And I thought, you know what, yeah, and you know, that camaraderie that was formed through that, and I guess the courage that I guess I had, but not really, was really powerful to me. And I'm glad that I spoke to my mentor and also my support system. And I'm actually glad that I didn't go to undergrad in Chicago. But now I'm back, and I'm happy, and I love Wesleyan. I love the experience that I had. If this were to happen again, I think I would take it to, you know, some higher authority, because what do you know as a first semester freshman? You're just trying to figure things out. So no offense to any of the tenured faculty in the room. I love you guys. You guys are doing amazing work. But yeah, so that's my story.
Yeah. Super, super powerful. Thank you guys for, so one of the things that strikes me, right, is not, I remember I wrote an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune a few years ago, and the editor of the op-ed page at the time said to me, you know, you're doing this interfaith work that you do, you're leading with your chin on the most divisive issue of the times, right? And like 2 weeks later, somebody said something unbelievably offensive to me, and I figured out, right? If you lead with your chin on the most divisive issue of the times, every once in a while you're going to get punched, you know? And so, Hannah, I think everybody needs to draw their lines, right? Like, I am not going to let this person say this to me. I'm not going to let this happen. And when you're on a Greyhound bus and somebody sits next to you and they think they're being nice and they're really deeply offending you, what does it mean to be an interfaith leader, right? And when somebody says something in a church setting that you think to yourself, you are hurting like my closest friends, what do you do as an interfaith leader? And when a tenured professor like basically tries to run you off campus, do you run? You know, you think to yourself, is there a way for me to be of some use here and maintain my identity, maintain my dignity, right? So I find these like such powerful stories. Thank you for living them, and thank you so much for sharing them. So let's give them a big round of applause, then we'll go to some questions.
Okay, so this conversation has been so amazing. We are running a little bit short on time, so we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. We'll get the questions first, and then we'll let the panelists decide how they want to answer them.
My strategy is to answer the easy ones.
Hello, my name is Elaine Krebs, and I go to the University of Southern California. And my question is that many of us here wear multiple hats at our university, so to say. So we're part of our interfaith groups, but we are also studying other things or involved in other things on campus, or some of us are student athletes. And I was wondering if you had tangible ways or stories that you can spread interfaith ideology of like respect and cooperation to your other organizations while wearing those hats necessarily. So like not coming off as like a preacher, like look at all this peace stuff I'm doing, but like things like that. If you have any stories or tangible skills or things we should think about.
I'll take one more.
Hi, thanks for speaking, first of all. I'm Eric Adamczyk. I go to Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you to Hannah for giving us a shout out, the city anyway. And I guess my question is, you know, as someone who has learned and is still a student of the concept of telling your own story, self, us, and now, how do you continue to use that concept after you've been in IFYC, especially since I think the context we're learning it in is trying to get people to relate to our stories and come to our campaign. So when you stop running that campaign, there seems like less immediate need for it, even if, you know, you're a pastor at a church or something like that. I mean, there seem like some obvious opportunities, but I would like to hear from the three of you where you see those opportunities come in to continue those storytelling skills.
So my suggestion is one of you answers. So let's not just go up and down the line and everybody answer each of those. So we'll get some more questions in the room. So who has a burning desire to take this question and who has a burning desire to take this question? Okay, Tasmiyah, why don't you start with that one?
Hey, so as a Muslim woman, I kind of always embody religion just when I walk into the room, just because of my dress, and I embrace it, I enjoy it. But I think that it's important to be careful and mindful of who you are talking to. For example, if you're going into your pre-med society versus a cultural group, South Asian cultural group, for example, I think being strong to your principles and showing that, you know, this is what I believe in and I am willing to be accommodating to certain aspects and not others, that can really speak to your character and also have people respect you for what you believe in. And if they like it enough, they might jump the bandwagon as well. So does that answer your question? Okay.
And just super quick, developing a verbal hijab, I think, is the way you bring your interfaith to other contexts. If you just casually mention, like, oh, when I was at the temple the other day, I was talking to my Jewish friend the other day, and people, their curiosity is piqued because they never hear that. Like, bring it up. Bring it up. People will ask you.
Either one of you have a burning desire on this question?
Well, so I can tell you about my thesis. Such a UChicago answer. Well, first of all, fight on. Those are awesome shirts. I want one. All right, I'm gonna have to go get one when I go back to LA. So I hope this doesn't sound like I'm just gonna go for it. I think of the university as a model public square, and there's sort of this idea in the United States still that when we're doing public engagement or civic engagement, we have to check our religious identity at the door because we can form thoughts and opinions without it, which I can't. Can anyone? I don't think so. Or at least our religion or our faith or our values are a central part of how we make meaning of who we are. And so if we want the world and our country and our community to be a public square where religion is welcome, we have to make our campuses like that because that's where we get to practice. So beyond campus and beyond telling stories on campus, I think Hannah has a great point. Just being able to tell stories whenever you're in a conversation with someone, being able to bring up ideas that people are, one of the first things people always learn about me is that I follow the paleo diet and that I do interfaith work. And the way that happens is just I every conversation I have, I find a way to relate to it, right? So I think having that bank of stories and remembering all the stories you hear about people that you've met at the ILI, keep those with you because you can bring them out wherever you are, whenever you're talking to someone.
Awesome. Thank you. Back to the audience. We have time for more? Prerna? Okay.
One question.
Stand up and shout.
Good.
Great question.
Is that?
So you know what? Let me. I am violating my own ethic here. I'm going to. So I'm going to offer an idea to that, and then we'll turn it over. Hannah, it seems to me like you devoted your life to Jesus. Person has something to say to this. So two very, very, very quick stories. So I had the honor of serving on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council, and one of the people who served with me there is a guy named Rich Staines, who's the president of World Vision, right? Maybe the largest Christian international relief and development organization there is, and somebody who I developed a great deal of respect for. So I'm like naive, I'm like embarrassed about this one, but here I am at this dinner of the Faith Council, and I'm talking to Rich about, I want him to like do interfaith work at World Vision. I know their evangelical commitments. I know the range of the relief and development work that they do. And at some point, he like figures out what I'm saying, that I think he should do interfaith work within World Vision. He's like, we have 5,000 Muslim staff. And I'm like, you do? Right? He's like, how do you work in Pakistan and Afghanistan without hiring Muslims? And I'm like, oh yeah, idiot. I've only done interfaith work for 12 years, right? But what struck me about that is that the vast majority of highly professionalized organizations, and I would put campuses in that category, right? And I think that President Parkin at North Park would have a lot of really smart things to say about this. They have dual commitments. They have a witness and an evangelizing and proselytizing commitment, and they have a relief and development commitment, and they have an ethical firewall, if you will, between the two, right? And so one is not a Trojan horse for the other. When they are proselytizing, they're proselytizing, and everybody knows it. They wear the red shirts. And when they're offering health care, they're offering health care. And everybody knows it. And they wear the blue shirts, so to speak, right? And I have such great respect for that, right? Both of them are expressions of their understanding of the tradition. And my favorite story on this is, I have a friend named Scott Alexander. Some of you probably know him. He's a professor of Catholic Muslim Studies at Catholic Theological Union, which is the largest Catholic seminary in the United States, down in Hyde Park. And he'll have a meeting with the cardinal once a year or once every 2 years. It's a 60-minute meeting, and the cardinal always begins with the question, Professor Alexander, you do know that it is part of the Catholic tradition to seek to convert Muslims. And Scott will say, yes, Your Eminence. And then the next 59 minutes and 30 seconds of the meeting is spent on the Muslim Catholic interfaith cooperation, dialogue, service projects they're doing, right? And I love that, right? I love this image of this is a part of the Catholic Church, and this is a part of the Catholic Church. And because you're in this role, this is the vast majority of your job. But you also have to be reminded that this also exists, right? And again, these are things that I frankly learned late in my life in interfaith work. And I felt stupid not knowing them before. But I guess my basic point is these traditions are genius enough to have developed that language and those mechanisms. And they didn't need me to like ask the question, right? I should have just been listening more. So Hannah, do you have a thing you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just they absolutely do, right? But witnessing to my unique experience is that because I converted to Christianity, I was evangelized to many times before I converted, and some of it worked and some of it didn't. And evangelizing to someone in a way that makes them feel in pain or unsafe is both bad interfaith work and bad witness. It doesn't work. Like that's the biggest thing. Evangelizing to someone in a way that makes them feel unsafe and coerced doesn't isn't effective. I had 100 people do it to me, right? Hold me hostage. You should enter a relationship with Jesus Christ or I'm not going to talk to you anymore. You should enter a relationship with Jesus Christ because if you don't, you and your whole family are going to hell. None of that worked on me. I don't think it works on hardly anybody. The stuff that worked on me was people who were there for me no matter what, just like Jesus always has been, and then also communicated to me about the way that Jesus had transformed their life. And I will not give up the right to do that. I do that. I tell people about the way that Jesus transformed my life. I tell them about the way I think it could transform theirs. I still treat them like a person if they say no, and I don't make it a ransom note for interacting with them. I don't make them allow me to do that first before I'll do anything else, because I have read the New Testament many, many times, and Jesus never did. So for my tradition, that's how witnessing and interfaith come together, and I think every tradition has that story.
What an awesome, awesome panel. Thank you, guys. I'm proud to know all of you, and I am like over the moon that you are part of Interfaith Youth Corps. And I am over the moon that you are part of Interfaith Youth Corps too. So have a great rest of your ILI, a great rest of your Monday night, and I'm going to turn it back over to Prerna, and we're going to go sit down.
So once again, if you're looking for a place to pray, it's in the Mulford room. You make a right out of the ball.